I'm Deborah Lockridge, editor and associate publisher of Heavy Duty Trucking, and today I'm talking to Lane Kidd. He's managing director of the Trucking Alliance and talking about a piece that he wrote recently called Trucking's Duty to Public Safety. Lane, welcome to HDT Talks Trucking.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's start off in a little context for anyone who is not familiar with the Trucking Alliance and tell us what it is in a nutshell.
The Trucking Alliance was created by about 7 large trucking fleets in the early 20s, primarily to advance some safety reforms they felt needed to be adopted, and we're just sort of moving along too slowly, in their opinion. An example would be the electronic logging device, which we advocated for in 2012, creating a drug and alcohol clearinghouse, recognizing hair drug testing, which all of the carriers implement in the Trucking Alliance as a more effective way than the DOT test. And then more recently, the automatic emergency braking mandate, which we worked with some safety groups in getting adopted. And then, we have 2 or 3 issues this year where we announced that we're going to begin working on as well.
CAT Scale Company provides the professional driver with an accurate and certified weight. We are the #1 choice for professional drivers. Look for the black and gold sign to get the weights you know you can trust.
So what prompted you to write this particular piece?
That's interesting because, we've all heard the phrase, when in doubt, just do the right thing. And I'm boarding a commercial airline flight. I split time between D.C. and Kentucky. And, it was a typical flight, and it was crowded and it was cramped. And we moved out on the tarmac and we sat for 30 minutes, waiting to get approval to take off so we could go to Charlotte, and then I could connect and come to D.C. And I'm sitting there, and it occurred to me, how many people actually die in commercial airline crashes anymore, because it seems like it's such a remote occurrence. And I found out that the odds of dying in a commercial airline, are like 1 in 10 million. Your chances of dying by a lightning strike are only 1 in 138,000. And I thought, man, that is amazing that the commercial airline industry has been able to achieve that level of success. And yet, the U.S. trucking industry and the U.S. commercial airline industry are regulated the same way by the U.S. DOT.
Right.
I mean, truck drivers and airline pilots both are in safety-sensitive occupations. And so U.S. DOT has more recently announced that it would like to achieve 0 traffic fatalities in the U.S. Well, we don't do as well as the commercial airline industry. And, since 2010, more than 45,000 people have been killed in accidents involving large trucks. Something like 1.2 million people have been injured. And we hate to say this. I love this industry. I've worked in it all of my career. But how do we as a U.S. industry rationalize that we kill 5,000 people a year and injure another 150,000 per year while we're delivering the nation's freight? It just doesn't comprehend. And so I just went back and thought, we have the same duty as the commercial airline industry to protect the public. And I think to some degree we have become so conscious about costs and expenses and efficiencies that we've forgotten what Congress intended us to be back in 1980 when they set the standards for insurance and liability for the industry to operate.
Comparing the trucking industry to airlines, I think people would probably argue that that's kind of not an apples to apples comparison. That commercial pilots don't have to deal with non-commercial vehicles pulling out in front of them without warning. So what would you say to those that would maybe call this an unfair comparison?
Well, and I've heard that, and people will say, well, you can't do the same thing because we have millions of trucks on the highway and the commercial airlines have thousands. And, they go on to explain that. motorists cause most of the accidents.
Right.
Well, all right. We can say, let's say that 70% of those accidents are caused by other motorists. That still leaves us with 30% fault. And so why don't we work on eliminating the 30% that we're at fault at doing? Secondly, we are seeing technologies emerging in this industry that now we have the ability, some say, to have, self-driving tractor-trailer rigs, that they're going to be even safer than truck drivers, and they will eliminate even the fault of the motorist in many cases in causing an accident, that these trucks can react so quickly that we can do that. Well, that may, we'll see in decades to come whether that's true. For the most part, truck drivers are going to be the livelihood of this industry.
Right.
But there are emerging technologies that can assist those drivers, and they're already happening. I mean, you can see videos now of lane departure warning systems and collision mitigation systems in which a car pulls right in front of a truck, and yet the driver, because of this technology, is able to avoid that crash.
Mm-hmm.
So we believe we can do a lot better, and we believe that our duty to the public should be the same as a commercial airline industry. At least we should try. We should give it a good effort, and so far we're not doing a very good job.
The Alliance has an ambitious goal of ultimately eliminating truck crash fatalities, which you point out when you say that's in your piece about the first duty of the industry to public safety. Again, a lot of people would say that's unrealistic. Why does the Alliance feel that it's even possible?
Well, because most consumer groups and most transportation stakeholders believe it is. We're part of a coalition called Road to Zero that's managed by the National Safety Council, which is a huge organization about safety in the workplace. It has adopted that. We are bound by duty to the public to eliminate all crash fatalities. And some people would say, oh, wait a minute, you certainly can't eliminate all car crashes and car crash fatalities, but there are 2,000 organizations in this country that believe we can. And so if we can eliminate those 45,000 deaths that occur in car crashes every year, then certainly we could eliminate these 5,000 that occur in the trucking industry. And that we believe that's a worthy mantle and a worthy mantra for us to adopt as an industry. And I'm encouraged because now I see some other major trucking organizations stating that, well, yeah, that is our ultimate objective, is to eliminate all large truck crashes. So it's a good thing.
The second thing that you write about in your piece is compensating crash victims if the motor carrier is at fault. As we go along trying to eliminate all these crashes, obviously be a while before we could get there. And as part of that, you talk about the minimum insurance requirement. And I know there's been a lot about discussion about that needing to be raised, pros and cons. Give us the highlights on that.
Well, I mean, mention to anyone, not anyone, but mention to most people who operate a trucking company if they think they should have a higher minimum insurance than they currently have, and they will resoundingly say, no, I can't afford it. I can't afford higher insurance.
Right.
And so you really have to step back and visit with that owner and ask him, well, okay, what do you believe that Congress intended in the 1980s when it deregulated the trucking industry from what had been a very regulated industry? They decided to deregulate to make it somewhat easier for people to get into the industry. What did Congress do? Well, Congress believed that if we deregulated the industry and didn't put any limits on who could enter the industry, that we would have a lot more carriers operating than could safely operate, that we would have underfunded, underfinanced motor carriers. And so they set the limit at $750,000. You had to either have financial worth of $750,000 or you had to post an insurance policy that showed that you had a $750,000 liability insurance policy. Why? Why did they do that? Well, couple of reasons. They thought that if they set the limit high, that insurance companies would be bound to underwrite to make sure that carrier was insured before it issued a policy in that amount, because a $750,000 policy in 1980 was a considerable policy. That same policy today would equate to $2.1 million liability policy. And so they wanted to make sure the carrier would operate safely, so they would underwrite that carrier. Secondly, they wanted to make sure that if a crash occurred and the carrier was at fault, there would be enough dollars there to compensate the victims for the injuries that they sustained. That's fair. That's something that I think anybody who operates their business in the public sector within 3 or 4 feet of motorists every day should have an obligation to do. Okay, fast forward 40 years. Nothing's been done to compensate for inflation or for the fact that in 40 years, everything costs more. McDonald's hamburger cost 35 cents in 1980.
Right.
And so are we underinsured today? Absolutely. Go talk to any insurance executive or an actuary, and they will say, we're absolutely underinsured. And then the comeback is, well, look at the settlements that are made. I mean, most of us settle our claims for much less than $1 million. Well, that's true to some degree, but take out the property damage claims and only look at the personal injury claims. And you'll see that most are settled at $1 million or right under $1 million. You know why? There's no more money there.
Right.
That's all the company has. And there are sadly and regrettably too many owners in the trucking industry who are okay with that. Well, what does that mean? I mean, if a person is injured in a heavy truck accident, those are usually and often a very severe injury. And those injuries last for the victim's lifetime in many cases. So there's a significant amount of damage done to that victim, and $1 million won't cover it in many and in most cases for those types of injuries. So who pays for it? Well, we do. You pay for it. I pay for it. Society pays for it, because that person, once they get the $940,000 settlement from the $1 million insurance policy, then they go to public service and they go to public services, and the government winds up paying for it and subsidizing the industry. The sector of the industry that doesn't get subsidized is, quite frankly, the larger carriers. The larger carriers are self-insured. You would never have a company that owns 1,000 trucks only insuring it for $1 million.
Right.
They're self-insured because they know that the real expenses are much higher than $1 million. And so compensating victims of a large truck crash is an integral part of our duty to the public. And you know, if a person can't afford to pay a little more insurance to meet its obligation to the public, and in most cases, an increase that would equate to maybe 2 steering tires on a large truck per year, I'm not sure they need to be in the business.
If we do talk a lot about pennies,
Yeah.
and get focused so much on those, absolute, I'm not going to buy this part because it's cost 2 cents more than the part I can get from this other guy.
Right. And we have become, as an industry, so conscious of that. And the industry does a great job of pinching pennies because, drivers are paid cents per mile, and freight is often hauled at dollars and cents per mile. And we have become such good at micromanaging a trucking company that any increase in expenses is one that, most people just can't handle. Well, there are ways you could make an increase in our minimum insurance more affordable, as the Interstate Commerce Commission used to do years ago. Let's put an insurance surcharge on every bill of lading. If Congress were to decide, or the DOT were to decide, okay, we're going to increase minimum insurance from, most carriers have $1 million at least, we're going to increase it from $1 million to $3 million, or from $1 million to $5 million, which If you use medical inflation, that would be $5 million today based on medical costs for compensating injuries.
Right.
How would we do that? How would carriers afford that increase? Now, there are groups like OIDA and other small carrier organizations that will say, oh my, if you increase it from $1 million to $2 million, it'll double the carrier's premium. No. We've done some actuarial analysis. We went to some of the major reinsurance companies around the country, and we said, hey, what if this occurred? How much would their premiums go up? Well, they go up 30%, 40%, maybe 50%. So that, if you're paying $5,000 per year per truck and it went to $5 million, your premium would probably go to $7.5 thousand per year. Congress could say, we're going to do this because we feel like the public's duty is one that the industry should abide by for safety. And so we're going to allow you to put an insurance surcharge on every bill of lading. So you could prorate your insurance charge for a particular shipment. And for a period of time, the customer would have to pay that difference. And then you could fade it out over a period of time. So, there are ways to do it.
I have fuel surcharges.
Yeah, we did it with fuel surcharges. Why not do it with an insurance surcharge? And then the industry can rightfully say, we're doing what we should be doing, in the public's best interest.
If that minimum financial responsibility was adjusted to equal today's dollars, what would that do for public safety?
Well, if you're an owner of a motor carrier, or even more importantly, if you're an insurance company, you're going to make sure the insurance is a safe bet if you're a carrier. So you're going to go out and you're going to underwrite that motor carrier, and you're going to make sure that the motor carrier is operating safely. Now, the problem and the challenge we have in the industry, think about this. We go out to the public, and we have a PR firm that does focus groups, and we ask the public, okay, did you realize there are more than 800,000 trucking companies on the U.S. highways today? No, they don't have any clue. Well, what if we told you that 95% of them don't have a safety rating? They're shocked. They say, what do you mean they don't have a safety rating? Well, they have to be regulated by the federal government, and they have to meet all of these federal regulations, but 95% of them, in those cases, the government doesn't know if they're operating safely or not. Yeah. Well, that's something the industry has to address. And so you're going to see if insurance minimums were increased, then there's going to be a really big effort on the part of the insurance industry to make sure these carriers are insured only after an underwriting visit is made. And motor carrier executives are going to make absolutely sure they're doing the right thing, because if they're going to have a $5 million liability, even though they're insured for it, they're going to make sure that their drivers are well trained, well rested, and drug free, and that they're using the latest technologies in all of their equipment. Will it cost more to be in the trucking industry? Yes, but it probably should. I don't think we'd want the commercial airline industry to run on the cheap. And I don't believe that people expect the trucking industry to either.
Yeah, every time you see the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration will issue something, they've put a motor carrier out of service, an imminent hazard. They're almost always really tiny fleets. Some of them don't even know they have regulations that require things like drug testing and maintenance. So
it really does boggle the mind. And FMCSA attempts, in my opinion, there are some great career employees at FMCSA who really believe in safety, and they have a monumental task to try and make sure the industry operates safely. But right now, the only thing they require is for the guy or the lady to file an insurance policy. Then they're issued a DOT number, and they can go out tomorrow and jump in their truck, and they're a trucking company, and they can slap a sign on the side of the truck and go. What? Really? Are we really that backward in the way that we're regulating what we like to say is the most efficient industry in the country. We deliver all of the freight that all of us buy. Yet we're not set to the standard that we should be.
In your piece, you talk about if we did raise that insurance minimum, that there actually would be benefits to motor carriers.
Yep.
Can you touch on that a little bit?
Well, I just think that, if you're going to see the industry improve if we did that. Okay, the obvious is that you're going to have accident victims that if the company was at fault, they're going to be adequately compensated. What happens today, and we hear a lot about plaintiff attorneys, and we've all seen the billboards of if you have been hit by a truck, and it rubs the industry the wrong way. But if victims were adequately compensated for the injuries that they do sustain, we'd have very little litigation. In fact, our analysts that looked at this, and even plaintiff attorneys with whom we visited, say that probably 99% of all claims would be settled because there would be enough insurance money that could be documented for economic damages. That's, actual loss of income, things like that could be tabulated. Right now, what happens is the plaintiff attorney plows right through the first million and tries to find some other company that they can sue. Maybe the shipper,
Right.
maybe a third-party logistics, maybe a broker.
Brokers. Mm-hmm.
Let's go after the big ones. If the small operator is leased to a major carrier, let's go after that major carrier, even though the operator may have been at fault and had nothing to do with the major carrier. Let's go sue that one. We'll eliminate all of that, and that will be a tremendous cost savings to everybody. And then what I mentioned earlier, the financial consequences of a serious accident. If I own a trucking company and I have $5 million, let's say, worth of insurance, I'm going to make sure that my drivers, like I said, are well-trained, well-rested, drug-free, have the technologies on the trucks that it should have. You know why? I don't want a $4 million judgment.
Right.
I don't want to be at fault and have a $4 million judgment because my insurance carrier the next year is going to hit me pretty hard.
Right.
And so we're going to have safer carrier operations. We're going to have a reduced burden on public resources that we now see these victims going to in order to receive additional benefits because there wasn't enough money from the small trucking company to compensate them for the fact they have a brain injury that's going to keep them from working for the rest of their life. Now, are those frequent? No. But it's like homeowners insurance. If my home is worth $500,000, should I insure it for that? Or should I insure it for only, let's say, $5,000 because most of the claims I'm going to make are only going to be that much? No.
Right.
I'm going to insure it for $500. So that's kind of the attitude I think that we need to see. And I guess most of all, we'll have more predictable premiums. I mean, premiums have been going up for larger carriers 30%, 40%. There's one carrier within the trucking alliance that has not had a reportable accident in 3 years. This is a big carrier.
Wow.
And the company's insurance premiums have gone up between 30 and 40% per year for each of the 3 years.
That's nuts.
It is nuts. And the executives don't understand it, and the insurance companies explain it away as the increased cost of doing business in the trucking industry. And if you look, there aren't too many players in the industry anymore. There aren't too many insurance companies that want to even insure a trucking company. You have a few little ones. Progressive insures a lot of the market space for $1 million carriers. You don't have many more. You don't have, you may have 3 or 4 more. And in the big markets, very few.
Yeah.
Fewer than 5.
It's been a big problem.
Yeah, and so I think if we see more less liability on the part of shippers and third-party logistics, and we see trucking companies having adequate insurance to settle most of the claims, the insurance markets will stabilize because the actuaries can predict after a year or two what the claims are going to be.
I know it's something that's been talked about at regulatory, congressional level, not a new idea, how likely is it you think this will happen?
Well, you have to look at whether it could occur more easily from a regulatory approach or a legislative approach. And until we had the funding for Ukraine and Israel, we really had not had any kind of a bipartisan vote in Congress on anything.
Right.
So I would tend to believe that a regulatory approach where all of the industry stakeholders would have an opportunity to weigh in on a proposed increase, that the increase is proposed within the Department of Transportation, that goes through a public comment period, and hopefully the industry could reach a consensus, or if not a consensus, a compromise on what the increase should be, then it would be better to do it from a regulatory standpoint. So we're looking at both options, but I would tend to believe at this point, at least, it would be better to do it within the DOT.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Lane. It's good to have you on the show.
Good. Well, let's come back and let's talk about the drug testing.
We will have to do that.
Okay.
All right. So I've been talking to Lane Kidd with the Trucking Alliance about trucking's duty to public safety. For more episodes of HDT Talks Trucking, go to HDT's YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platforms, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode.